Hello, good afternoon. Thank you all for being here, for those of you who are in the room with us, as well as those of you who are tuning in online. This session is called African Energy Pathways and is organized by CCG, Climate Compatible Growth. CCG is funded by the FCDO, the UK's Foreign Commonwealth Development Office, to support investment in sustainable low-carbon development systems to meet development priorities in the Global South.
If you wish to ask a question at all throughout this event, please use Slido. The link is www.slido.com and the code is 2715656. So I'll now introduce to you the chair of today's session, Yacob Mulugetta. He is the Partnership Director of CCG and also the International Engagement Lead at UCL in London.
Well, thank you everyone for coming. I'm Yacob Mulugetta, and we have a really wonderful panel here to discuss, this broad theme around energy, African energy pathways. I think we're still waiting for one more person, but we might as well make a start here. So I'm just going to quickly introduce one-liner introductions to our distinguished panel here. Next to me is Philip Trotter, who is professor of sustainable development, sustainability. He's at the Schumter School of Business and Economics, University of Wuppertal. I think that's something that Meron couldn't pronounce yesterday. So I've corrected that, yeah? But he's also at the Smith School of Enterprise and the Environment at Oxford University. Next to him is Youba Sokona, who is the IPCC vice chair, but also held a number of leadership posts over the years. Set up, the ENDA, which is ENDA Senegal, which really spearheaded some of the early climate and development work, and then he was also led the OSS group. Moved on from energy towards prevention of desertification and issues of that nature, and then moved on to lead the African Climate Policy Center at UN Economic Commission for Africa. This is just a drop of what he's done. So Youba, thank you. Lily Odarno, who is director of the Energy and Climate Innovation Africa with the Clean Air Task Force. Lily also was a senior member of the World Resources Institute before moving to her new task. And glad to have you, Lily. She just led us through a very interesting discussion at their place. So this is like, payback, isn't it? Yeah. And then next to Lily is Dan Kemen, who's professor, with a huge kind of track record around energy and development. In fact, you could say that many of us, read some of his early work, which was quite inspiring. And now he's at the Energy and Resources Group at the Goldman School of Public Policy at the University of California, Berkeley. In his spare time, he also works with USAID. Would be very pleased to hear a bit more about that, how you make these combinations work, Dan. So, welcome. So, how we're going to conduct this, the next hour of discussion really is, to kick off with Philip, sort of talking around a paper that we recently published, and I think most of us on this panel are co-authors of that paper. The Africa needs context-relevant evidence to shape its clean energy future. So it's a paper that really started in different parts, in different conversations, and this was an attempt of our attempt, to try and bring together some of these voices in a kind of coherent way to try and respond to some of the rather disparate sort of conversations that were happening around Africa's energy future. And so let me hand over to Philip to really lead us through this discussion, and then we'll pick up on some questions following that. Thank you, Philip.
Thank you very much, Yacob. And yeah, I prepared a couple of slides, so if we can bring those up, that would be fantastic. Thank you very much. First of all, I have to thank you, Yacob, for being the humble person that you are, to let me present this work that we did together. You, of course, being the lead author. I'm kind of flanked by the first and the second author here, so this is a great privilege for me to be able to present this work that we've done. I do want to give a special shout out here before we get into it to the editor-in-chief, the chief editor, Nikki Dean from Nature Energy, who was instrumental in making this possible, that we actually published this ahead of COP. He's really, really facilitated this process and pushed us really hard, but also was extremely accommodating with the whole process. So thank you also to Nature Energy for making this happen, and also they did make it open access throughout the entire duration of COP, so people can download it for free. Right, so this paper is called, as Yacob said, is Africa Needs Context Specific or Context Relevant Evidence to Shape its Clean Energy Future. And the idea in this paper was really to sort of try to bring back a very heated debate that we had about African energy systems in the lead up to COP, really throughout the years and the last couple of years, and try to bring this much more nuanced perspective to it. So maybe just for those of you maybe not so familiar with this discussion, there's really this very heated debate on renewables versus natural gas in Africa, and what we found is that there's really a large lack of evidence when we think about this discussion. So the premise of the discussion is that long-term renewables have to be the foundation of African energy systems, because all African countries have signed up to the Paris Agreement. So in order to reach development and climate goals, there's certainly quite a widespread understanding that long-term renewable shares will have to be quite high. However, and this is absolutely key, the pathways to get there are very diverse across African countries, and the timelines, the technology mix, and the starting points are extremely diverse. This is the premise. Now, what we found unfortunate about this discussion is kind of how the different actors in the discussion were framing it. You really had this it's almost a vicious cycle of different opinions and different statements coming from the global north and from African countries that were kind of moving the discussion further and further away from this solid evidence base. You had the global north that decided to stop funding fossil fuels, first coal and then also natural gas abroad. But then as the Ukraine crisis set in, a lot of European countries then rushed back into Africa and said, now we want to develop large-scale gas exploitation on the continent, and at the same time, while kind of seeming to reverse this policy shift, or the policy direction that they had adopted just a year or two before, on top of that, there has been a failure to reach the $100 billion climate finance, and there's been a lot of blockage on the loss and damage issues. So what the global south then reacted, and many African leaders said this, is that there's calling out this hypocrisy of the global north, where Africa cannot develop fossil fuels, but at the same time when it's about European demand, all of a sudden the money is there and people can do it. And that hypocrisy has, or this calling out to hypocrisy has, I think, led to a lot of maybe more emotionally driven arguments also from leaders on the African continent to really go into fossil fuel development. And there's been the Kigali Communique, it's called, in 2022, where several different African countries have called for natural gas expansions. The issue that this group of scholars that we have on this paper has with this debate is really threefold. First of all, there's quite a salient lack of understanding how different the starting points are within the African continent. Africa is, in these discussions, so often treated as a single entity, and certain leaders speak of Africa as one entity, both from the global north and also from the global south. We see this. But African countries are extremely diverse in terms of their energy systems and where they currently stand. The second issue is that this whole debate is very loud and heated, but not really attached to African development priorities, where Africa needs to develop economically, it needs to develop socially, and it needs to be sustainable. But this debate is not really driven by a common vision what the energy systems in these countries should have to achieve. It's more a technology focus on the discussion, and not so much a development outcome focus. The third issue, finally, is that there's just a lack of evidence for these energy pathways. There's only, we looked at this in a lot of detail. There are only, in the entire literature, only 6 papers exist for African countries that were produced within African research institutions that even look at different economic, social, and environmental impacts of different energy pathways. 6 papers for the entire continent ever, and that is just not a basis. And a lot of these countries with high natural gas resources are not covered at all. So you're making these decisions that have decade-long implications pretty much into the dark. So these are the 3 issues, and now let me just dive into each one of these 3 issues here with a quick slide to illustrate that. So what we then did, in terms of the starting points, we just built on a set of really interesting research that just recently came out. A couple of them are also co-authors on the costs of capital that is very different across African countries. There's a brilliant piece by a PhD student from ETH Zurich, it's Churchill Agutu. He's also a co-author on the paper, and he has mapped the differences in cost of capital across all African countries when it comes to energy investments. And you see in Sudan, the average cost of capital is 18%. This was for off-grid energy, I think, for the cheapest cost of capital category that they looked at. It was 18% for Sudan and 2% for Botswana. This is a huge difference when you talk about levelized cost of electricity, where some solutions then make a lot of sense for Botswana that are more capital intense because capital is a lot cheaper, whereas capital intensity is really penalized in a country like Sudan. So this is just to illustrate how different certain cost optimal pathways would look like in these 2 countries. So we just illustrated this with just calculating the levelized cost of solar PV here, which is of course also driven by the solar potential and the cost of capital. And then we look at the electrification rate as well. So you have some countries in Africa who are pretty much almost entirely electrified. But then you have some countries who have barely any electrification. So if you group them together, what you're implicitly doing is saying that an energy transition in the Central African Republic, Malawi, or Burundi should look like the one that we have in Egypt, South Africa, or Botswana, and that just makes very limited sense. So this graph is really just to illustrate that we have this huge diversity in starting points. The second issue is on the development goals, and the nice thing about this is that we can actually use African development goals and a kind of a pan-African vision of development, because the African Union, in cooperation with all African governments, have published their own Agenda 2063, and you can group those into economic, social, and ecological goals. There's also institutional and political goals. We focus on a number of goals here. This is just verbatim quotes from the report, what these economic goals are, and we find that a lot of these goals that the African Union have defined are very closely linked to energy systems decisions that you make today. And we believe that all of these goals have to somehow be operationalized and assessed if we want to design energy systems and energy pathways on a national level. This is currently not being done, so there's really no evidence that actually looks at all these different aspects. There is not a single paper that looks at any country in an integrated and holistic manner across these development objectives that have been defined by the African Union. The third thing now is that the energy system pathways are very context dependent, and we just illustrate this in the paper with looking at any 4 countries. We could have picked any 4. We chose those because we do believe that they illustrate different points. Let me start with Ethiopia. Ethiopia is a country that is almost 100% renewable today already. They have, from their own money, as 100% Ethiopian funded, they have built a massive dam called the Grand Renaissance Ethiopian Dam. No, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. I always get this wrong. But it's one of the biggest dams in the world, and it's characterized by this large reservoir of water. And there's a brilliant paper by another one of our co-authors, Sebastian Sterl, who used to be at IRENA. He's now at the World Resource Institute. And he showed that because you have this large reservoir, you can actually use that as a battery, where you can introduce solar and wind at multiple gigawatts, and just when the sun is shining, when the wind is blowing, you can fill up the reservoir, and when it is not, you just drain the reservoir and run all turbines at full capacity, because they've kind of oversized this dam. So the onboarding of solar and wind is pretty much at zero cost in Ethiopia. So you can do this at a very quick scale, and it's cheap. They have a green growth strategy. Ethiopia has had this for 15 years. So the pathway, the meaningful pathway for Ethiopia is relatively clear. South Africa is another case where, of course, it's very coal-dominated, but there's been massive, just transition program at COP26. We heard this $8.5 billion announcement to transition South Africa towards renewables, but South Africa has long started this process, and they are amongst the leaders in Africa in installing solar and wind capacity through their auction scheme that they have been running. So they're well advanced into this curve and are quite quickly transitioning. A country like Burkina Faso then, of course, has maybe a similar fossil fuel share, but it's a very poor country, a country that is almost not electrified at all. And here we see that it could very well be a meaningful pathway for Burkina Faso to potentially go a little bit longer into this fossil fuel direction, just to be able to get energy to provide basic services like electrifying households, electrifying health clinics, education facilities, and so forth. Given their historically almost completely negligible CO2 emissions, this could very well be a useful case for Burkina Faso to ensure that basic services are needed. And then maybe one of the most interesting cases are those countries with a lot of natural gas resources, such like Mozambique, Senegal, Mauritania, Congo, Angola, because they're really at a crossroads right now. They could just go to renewables and build out their system, or, and this is what many of these countries are thinking right now, is to really go very heavily into natural gas development and go increase their fossil fuel share and then have to go back in the end. And again, without any research on these countries, it's tough to say right now which one of these pathways maximizes African development outcomes. So you have a very large set of uncertainties here. One thing that I also wanted to show is just looking at the pipeline of what African countries are doing. It's also very varied. So on a continental scale, the African pipeline, so these are all the power plants that are actually being planned on the continent right now, is solar and wind is maybe close to 30% of the pipeline, slightly below 30%. Whereas if you look at the US, the power plant pipeline is almost entirely renewable. You have a tiny little bit of gas plant, but there's a lot of solar and battery and wind are really dominating the US pipeline. And then you have some countries within Africa where, like Tunisia, Djibouti, that are very highly dominated by renewable energy, whereas others like Senegal and Nigeria, for instance, are planning to go down more this natural gas route. So just kind of wanting to break out that view of the African continent in general. So some countries are moving into this direction, others are currently not going into the high renewable energy shares just yet. And the big question, I think, what we then, after discussing this is, okay, so what? So what can we do really about this? And what this paper, I think, what the experience so far has shown is that there's a really high interest in building this evidence base for Africa to make these decisions. We have a good starting base. We managed to get 54 co-authors of the paper. 40 of them are African scholars. 50 different organizations are present. We have universities, think tanks, we have development organizations. You see, I didn't even manage to fit all the labels in here, but you see, some of these organizations that are present. So you certainly have a really good kind of, and everybody was really, the process of it behind this paper was very open and very productive and constructive. And you could see that this rang a bell with a lot of people. The paper is doing very well, so there's a general interest in the paper. We almost have 10,000 downloads already after not even 2 weeks of the paper being out, which is really a lot, especially for a paper that deals with, a continent or region that is usually not so much in the headlines of global energy discussions. And we just had a lot of social media interest in it, and there's certainly this relevance. I said it, that you have the decisions that we make now have decade-long impacts, and we can talk about those impacts later in the panel. But there's certainly a momentum to build more and try to build this evidence base. So yeah, that's me. Thanks.
Thank you, Philip. Really tour de force of presentation, really wonderful. To summarize all that into what was that, 4 or 5 minutes. I just wanted to sort of ask each one of you now a little bit of a reaction to the paper in terms of where we go with it, we've seen, the kind of interest that it has generated. But, first of all, why is it generating such an interest? But then the second thing is, okay, we know what the paper looks like, who it's communicating to, but where do we take it from here? If you could just, let me start with you, Dan. You've published so much over the years. You know exactly where each of your papers have ended up.
In the trash can somewhere. Exactly. The dustbin of history, I believe, is where they land.
And he has the insight of the reality.
Okay.
Exactly.
So I'll try to do more reality and less dustbin for
all right.
just a couple of minutes. So I want to kind of jump back and forth around two things that Yacob and Philip highlighted. One is that we clearly know that there's a diversity of approaches needed. That doesn't surprise anybody. But I think when you look at the graph for how different the actual LCOE of solar is, it highlights how different the situations are. So I want to just spend a few minutes on some of these micro, the innovation in solar and storage and the technologies, but then jump to the kind of the outcomes that I hope everyone here will demand from the leaders that are attending this COP and beyond. So yesterday, I'll start at the top and then I'll go down. So yesterday, presidents of Kenya and of Malawi got up back-to-back on stage, and they said that they were throwing their political and their financial weight behind a carbon market for Africa to export products and innovations, to fund further projects in Africa, and to recognize that one of the many things that gets left behind is not the innovative capacity in Africa, but the financing and the infrastructure so those innovations can take place in real life. And if you don't have a viable market by and for Africa, it is not going to happen. We know, at least I will say, the Wells Fargos, the German Landesbanks, the Santanders in Spain, they don't spend a second thinking about what will it take, what are the opportunities to invest and innovate and build capacity, both institutional and human, in Africa. That is not something that anyone at those banks goes to bed and wakes up and thinks, goes to bed thinking about and wakes up thinking about, unless they happen to be someone who came from the country, who for a short time is here and they go back. So there is a lack of capacity, and that's really what these two presidents were trying to highlight. So there are some nice words. The question is, how do we make those reality? Well, let me give you two micro examples from Kenya that kind of highlight this. 6 years ago, IBM got convinced by an African scholar in the US at one of their research laboratories they should really open a research lab in Nairobi. And they did that. And for a brief time, that was the most productive research lab of any of IBM's fancy, high-flung labs, spinning out companies, getting projects into the market. Now, that's per capita. It was one of the smaller institutes. Change of management happened at IBM, and they simply closed it. It wasn't they didn't think it was working well, it just didn't fit with the next Western-leaning leader at IBM in terms of an effort. That's a huge loss. That may just look like a line lost in a balance sheet, kind of sounds very much like it's from Dr. Zhivago, a form lost in a, but that might have just been lost in the spreadsheet of someone at IBM. But they made a big difference in Africa to lose an innovation center. Now, any of you who've been to Nairobi today know that it's one of the places that, I don't want to call it an analogy of Silicon Valley, that's the wrong idea, but it's a very African version of a place where apps and startups are popping up right and left, and infusing them with funding and opportunities to bring those technologies in front of governments, vendors, would really have a big deal. But episodic funding is all one can speak about. Another similar example, and it's early on, it has not failed, I hope it won't fail, but just a few years ago, the argument was made that mini-grids are changing so quickly in terms of the cost of solar, the cost of storage, that an effort to electrify not 5%, not 10%, but 100% of all of the health facilities in Africa that don't have reliable power today should be the target of a big international effort. My institution, Power Africa at USAID, put in lots of good words, a few dollars, more words than dollars, but a little bit of funding, and then through a partnership with the Rockefeller Foundation, the Bezos Earth Fund, a number of other partners, there are suddenly $2.5 to $3 billion available. And there's a new institution that I hope many of you will go to their booth called GAP, the Global Energy Partnership for People and Planet, Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet. It's an effort to take on these huge needs for mini-grids and to use health facilities as anchors. Health facilities need power much more regularly than many other customers, but the idea is these would be the hubs. You would power the health clinic or the hospital. You would also provide Wi-Fi services. You would provide electricity as a whole series of innovations that link back. And the idea is that this will not be donor funding after that initial $2.5 billion, not small, but not enough to solve the issue. In terms of, that's the capital, but those institutions, be it the Ministry of Finance in Nigeria, be it the Rural Energy Agency for the Congo, be it a cell phone company that's installing in West Africa, they have to make a business case, and they only get paid based on energy actually delivered. So using advanced sensors, check that the cold chain is never violated at one of these clinics. And those are things that we can do now that rarely do they get done by and for African institutions. So that's just an example of what are some of the things that we could do if the innovative power in Africa was not just harnessed, that sounds wrong, but was supported so it could then go forward and create its own new innovations. And so there's lots of examples like that. And every time you come to one of these meetings, what are the two things you always hear? There's no shortage of bankable projects. And then you go to institutions on the ground across Africa, across Southeast Asia, and they say, you might say that at the meeting, but we cannot find the funders for these projects. And I think what you get illustrated in this paper is, while the differences between countries are real, some are still very much in on natural gas, Mozambique. Some, like Kenya, President Ruto had a recent op-ed in The Guardian where he said, we are not only going to remain 95% plus clean energy, but we're going to become a manufacturing hub for solar panels, for batteries. We're going to do this in a community-based way. Those are the kinds of things that are totally bankable, but I guarantee you, once people leave the COP meeting, their interest will fade away unless there's real loud voices saying, you promised, pay up, because what we know happened in Glasgow, people promised and didn't pay up. So I think that we've got lots of examples where the work going on in this paper just highlights how much opportunity, but how little follow-through there often is in these Western, not just dominated, but Western visioning institutions.
Thanks, Dan. Thank you so much. So much to take from there as well in terms of, that there is at least a semblance of interest by the leadership. We know that President Ruto has made that statement and one or two others as well. But also this issue of, the kind of pent-up entrepreneurial energy that is being unleashed in a few places, not everywhere, but at the very least, we see glimpses of that. And I guess, Lily, if I can turn to you, your kind of reactions to the paper, where we take it to, but perhaps also kind of bringing some of the conversation we had earlier about, Africa-led. What does that represent? What does it look like, for you, for example?
Thanks very much, Yacob, and thanks very much for having me here. I think 2 weeks ago, where was the paper published 2 weeks ago? I came across the paper and read through it, and I wrote to Yacob immediately. I said, we needed this yesterday. And the reason why I said that was, it was so clear that the energy transition debate in Africa or about Africa had become so polarized to the point where we didn't even know what meaningful action would look like. And I felt that the paper was so powerful because it basically told everybody, let's stop all the noise and begin to think. And that is extremely important given where we stand now as a continent, thinking about our energy future and thinking about what climate impacts mean for the continent. And so I think I really want to applaud the authors of the paper for making this possible. 54 authors. I just told Philip that I think it's one for each of the African countries. So, but I think it's amazing to have that representation of scholarship. And for me, one of the things that is critically important as we have this conversation here is what stops us from having this type of knowledge out in the ongoing debate, and how can we begin to proactively think of even preempting some of these divergences in views which become not constructive, and begin to build the research and the knowledge and the evidence ahead of those divergences so that we are ahead of the game. And so I think that there's a strong, I think what this paper, for me, going through the presentation and just reading it and looking at how it's being patronized, is that there are people who are lots of people are looking for common sense approaches to the conversations which are going on, but they may be missing. And so I think that for the whether it's for the academic and the research community, we have a huge role to play in making sure that we are building the evidence and we are contributing and providing the evidence in ways that people will actually read and digest and use, which is extremely relevant. I think that the length of the paper, the nature in which it was written was very, very concise, clear to the point. It's easy to get exactly what is in there in the paper. So I think we need another type of scholarship which is able to break down the complexity in our messaging into ways that people can understand, relate with, and engage with. But I think the second thing the second point which I would highlight here is how we value the knowledge that we are creating. So now we have this paper out. How many of our African leaders policymakers are going to engage this, take this, absorb it, and use it in policy formulation. I think there's still a bit of work that's needed there in terms of the evaluation of the knowledge that we generate internally within the African continent. I think it's not really that there's no research. I think Dan just talked about the research in the dustbin. And there's a lot of research in our academic institutions, PhD theses sitting on shelves. Some of them may even have addressed this issue sometime in the past. Nobody knows where that knowledge is. And our policymakers are not looking into the right spaces for the knowledge that is needed. It's not uncommon to see African governments reaching out to some foreign consultants to put together something that, a group of African scholars could have put together for them. And I think we need a change in that, how we value the knowledge that we are generating itself, because this is a critically important conversation and we cannot afford to have anyone define the narrative for us. This morning we had a panel, and I was privileged to have both Yacob and Youba join on the panel, where we were trying to explore what an African vision of the energy transformation is like, or could be like. And this was one of the points, that we need to build the intellectual foundation that helps us to be able to convey that message of what Africa wants and where Africa wants to be. And I feel that the messages in this paper, personally for me, are so powerful if we can use them to recenter the conversation which is going on, which was had basically gone off the rails. And so I applaud the authors of the paper again. I believe there's a lot to be done, and especially thinking about how we move this from the intellectual piece to actual practice.
Thank you, Lily. Thank you so much. There's quite a lot there in terms of guiding us what to do with the paper, but even beyond that, some of the areas where leadership is going to be desperately needed. And I guess, this is where I come to you, Youba, in terms of where is that leadership going to come from? I know that you're very involved with the youth. I know you believe that a lot of the positive energy lies in the future, in other words. But how is that going to be harnessed? What needs to be done in order to be able to build that capacity as we move forward?
Yeah, I think that this can be responded easily, but it may require one day. Yeah, the paper is behind us. It's finished, because it's a start of the beginning. And then this behind us. And then we have to explore and what is needed. And then what are the missing link, the critical element that are missing. And then Dan said that we do have a lot of examples that things can work, that can change for better the life of the people. But we take for granted a number of things. And this is what we try to indicate in the paper. But the technology, we are not exploring the technology aspect, because there is specificity of Africa, socially, culturally, economically, particularly the end-use technology and the end-use equipment. Because if you want to have a stove, if you take a stove that functions in London, and then you bring it to Wataguna in a remote part of Mali, that will never function. But you need to design and to define a stove in the context of Mali that's adapted to the socio-cultural context. Because on the technology side, there's a lot of things we need to do. And then we are neglecting that. The second element is that we have to make a clear distinction between investment and finance. Because investment can come from everywhere, even inside Africa. But we need some finance in order to be able and then to determine those different elements. And I think that that's very important for us. And what is neglected also, we are thinking for new new ways of the different possibility, but we are lacking to question fundamentally the institutions. Because the institutions through which we are operating, including the energy institution, are no longer valid, and then to bring about the kind of innovation we are thinking of. You know, you take former utility, they are no longer valid, and then to harness all the knowledge that has been captured for many years, and then we need to think through the institution. It is not only the energy institution, the research institution. We do not have, you know, a say on the policy part, but we do have something to do also on knowledge-based institutions. And this is where the group like here, and then those who are participating in the paper, and then we can create a new type of institution, and then to start working on that. What it will require, this type of institution will require 10 days of done in a year. I said that I will give to you 10 days of my workload to this type of institution and then to work on this issue in Africa. Lily will give 10 days. Philip will give 10 days. All the people who are committed in this room to say that the entire year I will give 10 days of my workload and then to work on those different issues we are defining. And we create a virtual, you know, organization. And then how long it has taken us to produce this paper? Less than 2 months. Mobilizing more than 50 people all across the world, interacting intensively, and that can be done. So we have to innovate, institutional innovation. And then what is needed, what we can bring, and then that will cost, it will cost money, because giving 10 days of my year, it costs money. But I will not give directly this money. And then this is possible if we put in place a mechanism and then to work on those. And then this is the way also of bringing in and then the new blood, the new generation. They will be excited and they will be part of the crowd. And then they will, you know, they have more agility than we have, those kind of agility in thinking outside of the box and then to be much more innovation. Because we need much more, you know, institutional and social innovation than anything else. Because if we bring that, you know, things will get much more easier. We can go in depth on that. Sorry to be too long.
Thank you, Youba, for committing Dan to 10 days of his his year. He's on stage, he's being videoed, so he's signed up to it, yeah?
I do a lot more than 10.
I know it. Anyway.
Useful, but
well, just continuing that, you know, this discussion, Philip, I know that, you know, you are, you know, very much committed to the whole transforming, you know, the African energy issues. You work quite deeply on, you know, this is something which is the latest, but, you know, you've got quite a lot of track record on that. I guess my question is, you know, when we are, you know, thinking about, you know, the next stage, what is your, you know, your thinking? I mean, Youba has sort of laid out in the way in which, you know, it ought to happen, but just, you know, some thoughts from you as well, please.
Yeah, thanks, Yacob. And first of all, I mean, if you say 10 days, 10 Youba days, that's 30 for me, right? If you think about the hours. So I'm very happy to do that, 30 days plus Youba. Two things. One is just on the content, and the other is on the process of what you think. The content, I really like what Dan brought up, this issue of innovation. Just a couple of stats here. So I looked recently into this issue of startups. In 2015, the entire African continent, all startups on the continent managed to raise $55 million. That is as much as, you know, your average Silicon Valley, you know, startups does, like Series C, Series D type funding, like one startup, right? That's what the entire African continent raised. In 2022, it took the entire continent 7 weeks to raise $1 billion. That's a growth rate that is unfathomable. And people are understanding that there is this unbelievable amount of potential, and people are calling it in investment circles, the next China, whatever, the framing could be there. And you see it now with the economic crisis in startup funding. In each and every single world region, the funding has gone down. That is true for each region, except for Africa. Africa is still growing its startup funding despite the economic crisis, the price increases, and you would think, all these risky investments. No, it's actually still, the growth rate has slowed, but it's still growing. So there's certainly a lot of interest in that. And now from an academic point of view, what I find striking is that nobody's looking at this. There is no research on these startups and innovation that is coming out. So I think we also, when we think about what do we need to look at and what can we foster, is really try to work very in a way, Youba always says this, to solve problems, to not just write some fancy papers that end up in a dustbin, but something that actually makes a difference. And I think this entire startup, this entrepreneurship, this African-led entrepreneurship and innovation is something that has tremendous amount of potential for real impact and for learning from it and for scaling it up, because indeed the investment is there. So I think that's something that we can really work with. And one thing, when I looked at some of these startups, what I found interesting is that you have a lot of these energy companies that then also are really innovative in their business models, where they start out maybe just wanting to electrify a certain village, but then they actually go into value chains, into rural value chains, buy equipment and then become, agricultural, like, fish cooling or something. Then they become agricultural value chain companies, if you want, and really generate income for people and can use the extra money that they get to cross-subsidize household access, to cross-subsidize access for health facilities, for education facilities. So you really have this drive of these innovators that want to bring sustainable development. Their core mission really is not to just be profitable and get, go in, extract and pull out. They want to be in it for the long term, and they want to kind of benefit only if the community benefits. And when you speak to these African entrepreneurs, it's extremely inspiring. So I think there's a lot that we can learn from that. This more bottom-up approach where energy plays such a big role. So that's on the content. The process, what we need to think. How I, of course, I'm conscious, right? I'm a white guy, right, from Germany, working on African issues. So for me, it was one of the most insightful discussions that we had the day before yesterday with Youba and also with Fatima Denton, who's the director of the United Nations University in Accra. And I actually asked Fatima, Fatima, what can I do? I'm this white guy, and we have kind of the knowledge creation and the focus that is there that is very much dominated by people like myself. And Fatima said that we have to move beyond collaborations. It's not about, it's when we say, collaborations, it's usually, I come and write my research proposal, and then I call Youba and say, Youba, there's this, on paragraph 3, there's this thing, I need this African partner. Can you be my partner? And then we put this, and Youba gets some 10%, and I get 90%, and we go. So then I end up asking the research question. I define the agenda, and Youba is my colleague and my partner, and I need him to do the research, but it's still very much driven by those who have the money to do the research. And I don't think that that's going to change very soon. Germany has more money for research than Ghana. That is a fact. But can we change how we use that money? Can we change who writes the research question? Can we change who we hire and how this works? I think we can. And Fatima was making this point that it has to be African-led. And I can then help Fatima achieve those goals, but have her lead, have her write the questions, have her, understand what African countries and her specific context needs. And I think this is something that I think we can all take and really ask the challenging question to ourselves: whom am I creating value for? And so that's something that I aspire to do more of, and I learned a lot from working with you, working with Fatima. So yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you, Philip. Adding value and ensuring that it is Africa-driven. I think, Dan, we've heard these, words and these sentiments for a long, long time. My question is, to what extent has the kind of the landscape, the policy landscape, the financing landscape changed for us to be able to deliver something like this or something even close to it? I've abandoned all the questions that I have here. It just looks...
I'll answer very quickly because I'd love...
Yeah, to hear, yes. Please prepare your questions.
Okay. Oh, okay. I can't tell if it's on or not.
No, there's a light.
So I would like to think it's changed. I come to COPs and I'm optimistic in the early days, and my optimism declines exponentially by the end of the 2 weeks. Not so clear. I thought what was said yesterday was a really good example of an actual innovation, but we'll see what leaves the COP. People left COP26 in Glasgow thinking that there had been kind of a change, even if all the money wasn't delivered. So I think that one has to be really skeptical, and I guess one of my worries is a much broader one than this, and that is that in many ways, these kinds of settings are places where people are pitching ideas to the true believers. 90% of people come here want to be convinced. They want to sell others on their great paper and new ideas. Business is very poorly represented here. Banks are very poorly represented here. Politicians will do things like happened last year. They'll go to the G20 meeting in Milan 3 days before the COP, and then they'll vote to continue to subsidize fossil fuels. And they'll come to COP, and then they'll say all these great, wonderful slides with beautiful animations. And so I would like to think we're going to leave here with a new mindset. We're going to invest in research in Africa. We're going to uplift things like the Mawazo Institute in Nairobi. This is an institute that was founded by a Kenyan woman who came to the U.S., got her PhD in chemical engineering, worked in mini-grids at the Department of Energy, went back to Kenya, founded an institute to train and support African women to become leaders. And it was so successful, she actually moved on now to the Energy for Growth Hub, and someone else in the organization is now the new CEO. They're great. They get every award, but they're still massively underfunded. So I would love to see these kinds of cases not, as you say, getting the 2% of the pie. Right? Africa is 17% of the world population, and less than 2% of the international financing. We just see this stat after stat that highlights how we say these great PowerPoints, and then, we're PowerPoint, not power plant. And I think that that's what we need to find a way to hold ourselves to, and that's largely a responsibility in the West. Right? We talk a lot, and I'm not clear we deliver very much, but the data is very, very sharp on these points. So.
Any questions, please prepare, but I will pick up one or two from this Slido. David, this one is for you, Lily. It's a question about empowerment. How do we empower analysts to do the kind of visioning that we're talking about here and translate this into concrete outcomes, whether they are bankable projects or even innovative sort of ideas leading us to fruition?
Thanks for the question. It's a really important one. How do we empower analysts? And I will talk about analysts and maybe talk a bit on the innovation and in the clean energy space a little bit as well. If our understanding of the complexity of the energy access, energy development, transformation, transition challenge is evolving, and we are beginning to understand the complexity that is involved in the process of actually redefining what Africa's energy system looks like and engaging more African knowledge and expertise on it, I think the starting point is how we train our experts. And I believe that in a lot of African institutions, there's a lot of work to be done in terms of helping build that foundation for interdisciplinary thinking right from the get-go. Most of the time, the structuring of our educational system, even at the university level, tends not to translate directly to the complexity of the challenges that we are going to be addressing when we leave. So some engineers, not much exposure at all to anything in economics or in the social sciences in any shape or form. We have these silos within which we build knowledge. And so when we are put into various institutions after school, we struggle to understand and appreciate the interconnections between specific areas of expertise and what is happening in other areas. But clearly, the challenge ahead of us requires that the effort is cross-sectoral. It's a complex issue. It's not just a question of technology. It's economics, it's finance, it's policy, it's culture in terms of thinking about how we develop and evolve our energy systems. And so I believe that there's a big role for us to rethink how we train and who we train. And I think that within the African continent, there's huge scope, as even at the graduate and postgraduate level, also to ensure that the skills that we are imparting are relevant to the challenges that are being felt. I also mentioned this before. How do we make research more relevant to policy? It's a big challenge in Africa. There's such a disconnect between the research that's happening in the universities and the policy shifts. And after being in the US for a while, I realized that over there's a lot of innovation that comes out of the universities. It's appreciated, it's picked up, it's expanded, and it creates change. And that's what we need. We need that seriously at the African continent. I wanted to talk a bit also about finance in the clean energy space specifically. I think picking on the Kenyan example, I think the question of how much finance we need or the structure of finance and all of that also requires that we think about who benefits from the available funds. And even in Kenya, where we've seen, this thriving industry in the off-grid space, for instance, the local entrepreneurs in Kenya are still struggling to access funding to be able to expand their projects. Most of the investment that's going into the space is still going back to Western companies. So the local entrepreneur is still struggling to access the funding. And usually it's because the proposal you put together doesn't make the cut. Can we think about structures that can help, or institutions that can work with these entrepreneurs to build their capacity practically to be able to put together proposals that work? So I think there are very clear examples about how we can bring together some of the knowledge that we are developing with real examples. I was in Nairobi in a conversation with KPLC, and they have a research unit they're looking to access some GCF funding. And the process is so complex, they just need someone to write a proposal for them. These are real needs which need to be met. And I believe that the research institutions can play a role in that. And we have to think about those types of partnerships which practically can connect the knowledge that we generate with the impact. So who can help them to put together, build the analysis that helps to concretize the proposal that is being put in. So there are opportunities there. I think that the money is available, but the access to the funding is still missing, and there are still huge capacity gaps there in terms of who has access to the money. So if we want to drive change and make sure that we have an African-led agenda, Africans are benefiting from the agenda, then we need to make sure that we are connecting the knowledge and expertise at the top with what's needed at the bottom. Thank you.
Thank you, Lily. We don't have a huge amount of time, but were there any questions? I still have one or two on the Slido. Yeah, Slido is good? Okay. Yeah? Okay, perfect. But I'm going to ask one question from the Slido, but before that, I would like you guys to also think about, because we're talking about partnership, building partnerships across institutions, across academic, but even with civil society as well as private sector and so forth. If you could sort of, chew over some ideas about what kind of partnership, particularly partnerships, north-south and south-south, for us to reflect on as a final discussion point. But on the Slido, there was a question. Maybe I'll pick you up, Youba, because I like to put you on the spot. It's on the question of, the renewables and materials for renewables. Yeah. So, for example, in 2020, China bought 9 billion worth of energy materials from DRC. So there's a lot of extraction going on. And this is likely to scale up even more as we go deeper into the whole decarbonization agenda. How does Africa tap into some of this value in a way that it doesn't just become an extractive economy? What needs to happen?
I think that this is not part of the conversation yet, because, the zero carbon, everyone is talking about zero carbon from the renewable, but no one talking about what is before getting the panel and the batteries. And this is an issue we need to explore. And then the environmental consequences and social consequences, what is happening in DRC. And what needs to be done is exactly to start exploring and then to give more, to work on those different issues and then to better inform the policymakers in Africa, as well as to inform also the decision makers in the climate debate and discussion. Because no one questions it. It looks like you have a tree somewhere, you go and then you just grab a panel and then a battery, and then you go to install, you have your zero carbon. And those need to be done. And maybe I did not explain clearly what I have in my mind to say that when I said done to give 10%, 10 days a week. I said that how you came up with CCG. CCG is a number of universities in the UK working on an equal basis on a number of issues. Because how that CCG has been created is because they put money on it. In the African context, we have no money. And then we can create something. If people will those who are interested, they will join it. How they will join it? Because we don't have money, but we have our working time, hours. I can give one month of my working time on it to work on any issues where I have expertise for the system we are creating. It's not based on money, because the money is the incentive. As we don't have the money, and then we have our own engagement on it, and it can become very large. Many people will be interested to join that process. And the issues of, the minerals, and then we can explore them. No one is really carefully looking at it in the African context. And then those are some of the areas we need to really. Yeah.
Thank you for bringing us, right into the whole, the question around partnerships. I mean, that's what we're talking about. Building, the kind of network that allows us to work together and actually, explore some of those unexplored issues. I mean, it's more, the same thing happened with the AREI. This is the Africa Renewable Energy Initiative. When it happened, it was largely done by people who were committed to it and devoted their time. But we're talking about, much grander scale sort of commitment and ambition as well. So on partnership, let me come to you, Philip, and then we'll just go down this way. But take 30 seconds, no more.
Yeah, I'll try. I think, we always talk about eye-to-eye partnerships. I don't believe in that. I believe the resources are so unequally distributed, that just in general there is really no eye to eye, even if we try to do it. So I think from the Western side there needs to be an active effort to listen a lot more and have partnerships where the leadership is clearly from Africa, and then maybe we can talk a little bit about eye to eye at a later stage. But I think who creates the knowledge I think has to be flipped.
I think I would like to see a better partnership between the research community and the policy-making community. We talk about it a lot, but I think it doesn't exist much in Africa. And I believe that that's one of the areas where we can make the most impact, how we are able to link our research with policy. And we need to think creatively about what that means and what types of strategies that we can use to connect the research with the policy, whether it is engaging the policymakers in shaping the research questions so that they feel more invested in the research that's going on. Whatever that strategy is, I think that is an area where we are critically lacking and could make huge impact if we are able to get it done.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly agree with everything we heard here. I mean, I guess, there was a slight historic event that loss and damage, which was not fully on the first agenda, got put back on the first day. If anything happens at this COP, if loss and damage gets locked in, I don't mean just a political statement, but for example, in the United States, it looks like the Democrats will survive with their thin margin, or maybe they'll lose the House, but it won't be some shift in the other direction, at least. So one of the things that our president is doing is saying that there needs to be a fund. Basically, there needs to be a windfall profits tax on oil. That's great. That's going to not sell in oil-producing and red states. It's going to sell well in where I'm from in California. But the only thing that really matters out of that is if there would be the guts in the U.S., in Japan, in Norway, to say, and we're going to donate a certain percentage of that money consistently, not a fixed dollar amount, but a percentage of those revenues to this international fund, not controlled by European and Western banks, controlled by African banks and those in Southeast Asia. That would be the kind of investment that would rebalance the equation. It would not be a politically popular thing to do, so I think we can assume it's not going to happen overnight. But that would be the kind of thing that if any of us who spend our time coming to these meetings and talking to our heads of state were serious about it, that would be the kind of change that would rebalance. There'd be money for R&D, money for community projects, money for adaptation for Africa. Those are things that would make a big difference. But any of you who smirked at when I said that, and I think you should have smirked, should recognize if we smirk at that, given all the conversation, we're at COP number 27. I've been going to COP since COP 11. That is what we should be getting out of this. And that's, if we don't do that, then we're not actually serious about fixing climate change or racial injustice. And climate change and racial injustice are deeply linked.
Now, can I say? Yes, I do agree with Philip that partnership will not work at all, because it will be completely imbalanced, because you are operating through institutions that has to respond to some interests of the countries. But solidarity can work, and the solidarity cannot work through institutions because they're not meant and then to deal with solidarity. That can be individual engagement. I am committed, I want to do it, and then let us create a platform where people will get engaged. And then at certain level, partnership can work, because that means all the partners will get some benefit. You came with concrete ideas. On the solidarity, I just came with the idea of giving. Yeah.
Well, there you go. We will end with that note. Thank you very much, Youba. That's a nice way to conclude. You know, solidarity, work on my terms, help me out, but you come in with your ideas, but not with your agenda, essentially. So thank you very much, and I think we'll stop it here. I mean, we could have gone on for another week. Huh? But we don't have a week, because if we do take a week, then, we would have exhausted Lily's and Dan's 10 days. So let's use it for something else, yeah? But thank you very much, Dan, Lily, Youba, and of course, Philip as well. Thank you for the wonderful presentation, and everyone else as well. Thank you so much.